If someone had said in the 1990s that France had its own answer to the Porsche 911, Ferrari 348, Honda NSX, and Lotus Esprit, many car enthusiasts would probably have smiled in disbelief. Back then, the French were associated more with brilliant hot hatches, comfortable executive sedans, and bold engineering solutions than with a fully fledged, hand-built sports car featuring a mid-engine layout. And yet, that is exactly what the Venturi Atlantique was, an elegant, rare, and today almost forgotten French coupe that, in its best form, could reach around 280 kilometers per hour and accelerate to 100 kilometers per hour in a time comparable to the greatest icons of the era. This was not a car built by a giant corporation, but by a small company that truly believed it could stand alongside Porsche, Ferrari, and Aston Martin. The Venturi Atlantique was a car with ambitions far greater than its manufacturer's budget. It had the style of an Italian exotic, the engineering spirit of French automotive design, a hand-finished interior, and the character of a low-volume grand tourer. The problem was that even a great car is not always enough if the world does not know your brand. The story of Venturi began in 1984, when Claude Poirot and Gérard Godefroy, two former engineers associated with Houllier, decided to create a French sports car brand. At first, the company was called MVS, which stood for Manufacture de Voitures de Sport, and its ambition was to build stylish, luxurious, and fast grand tourers. The first prototype was shown at the Paris Motor Show, and although it was still technically based on fairly ordinary components, it attracted significant attention. Early cars used parts from Volkswagen, Peugeot, Renault, and other manufacturers, which was not unusual in the world of small sports car brands. What mattered more was that Venturi had its own philosophy from the beginning. The car had to be lightweight, mid-engined, well-finished, and more elegant than brutal. The French did not want to build a kit car, but a true rival to established marques. In the following years, the construction matured. More powerful PRV engines appeared. Better suspension systems were developed, interiors were improved, and bodywork became increasingly refined. In 1990, the brand adopted the name Venturi, and its cars began to be seen as something far more serious than just an interesting curiosity. At the beginning of the 1990s, Venturi started playing a very bold game. The company created its own one-make racing series for gentleman drivers, tried Formula One in cooperation with LaRousse, entered Le Mans, and built extreme racing and road cars such as the 400 Trophy and 400 GT. It was the Venturi 400 GT that became one of the most impressive French sports cars of that era, with over 400 horsepower and carbon brakes, which were an absolute sensation in a road car at the time. But such ambition came at a price. For a small company selling only a few dozen cars per year, motorsport and new model development were an enormous financial burden. Venturi gained recognition, but at the same time, it began drowning in costs. The brand needed a more civilized car, something more attractive to customers and easier to sell than pure racing monsters. That is how the idea of the new Atlantique 300 was born, a car that was supposed to combine sporting character, grand touring comfort, and the appearance of a modern supercar. It was meant to save the company and prove that France could truly build its own Porsche. The Atlantique name itself had appeared earlier, because Venturi had already offered the Atlantique 260, a model derived from the brand's older designs. It was a lightweight, mid-engined coupe with a turbocharged V6 engine of around 2.8 liters and approximately 260 horsepower. However, the true leap forward came with the Atlantique 300, unveiled in 1994 at the Paris Motor Show. The project was completed in an exceptionally short time, about 6 months after the company was taken over by Hubert O'Neill. Gérard Godefroy was once again responsible for the design, and he decided to move away from the sharper, more angular shapes of older Venturis and give the car a much softer, more modern silhouette. Pop-up headlights were retained, but the overall shape became rounder, cleaner, and more aerodynamically refined. From the side, it was easy to notice inspirations from the Ferrari 348, the later F355, the Lotus Esprit, or the Honda NSX, but the Venturi was not a copy of any of them. It had its own French flavor, less theatrical than Ferrari, more luxurious than Lotus, and more exotic than Porsche. The body of the Atlantique 300 had the classic proportions of a 1990s sports coupe, a very low front end, a flowing roofline, the engine mounted behind the cabin, and large side air intakes feeding the engine bay. The bodywork was made from composites, mainly polyester resin and fiberglass, while some elements such as the doors and engine cover were made of aluminum. Venturi made use of experience from the French yacht industry, so it was no coincidence that companies involved in boat construction participated in body production. The car had a drag coefficient of around 0.31, which was a very good figure for a low-volume sports car. Underneath was a solid steel structure with a central backbone chassis and advanced suspension designed to ensure precise handling. The Atlantique was light for its performance level. Depending on the version, it weighed around 1,250 to 1,280 kilograms. That meant it was noticeably lighter than many of its competitors, including the Porsche 911 Generation 993, and low weight was one of the car's greatest strengths. Technically, Venturi remained faithful to the PRV V6 engine, a power plant jointly developed by Peugeot, Renault, and Volvo. It was an engine that found its way into many cars, from luxury sedans to the Alpine A610, and even the DeLorean. In the Atlantique 300, a 3-liter version of this V6 was mounted centrally behind the driver and passenger. In naturally aspirated form, the engine produced around 210 horsepower, but that version was more of a cheaper and calmer proposition, often paired with a 4-speed automatic transmission. The real character of the car emerged in the turbocharged version. There, the 3-liter PRV with a Garrett T3 turbocharger produced around 281 to 285 horsepower and approximately 420 newton-meters of torque. Power was sent to the rear wheels through a 5-speed manual gearbox. On paper, it may not have looked as dramatic as Italian V8s, but in practice, thanks to low weight and strong torque, the Venturi was very fast. The sprint to 100 kilometers per hour took around 5 to 5.5 seconds, and top speed reached approximately 280 kilometers per hour. In 1998, the most refined and most desirable version arrived, the Atlantique 300 Biturbo. This version used the newer L7X engine, a 3-liter V6 with a 60-degree bank angle, known from later Peugeot and Renault models. The unit was equipped with 2 turbochargers, allowing it to produce around 310 horsepower and approximately 394 newton-meters of torque. More importantly, the twin-turbo setup improved throttle response and reduced the turbo lag that characterized the older version. As a result, the Biturbo felt more flexible, more modern, and better suited to the character of an exclusive GT car. Acceleration from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour was quoted at around 4.7 to 4.9 seconds, while top speed was around 275 kilometers per hour. Although the maximum speed was similar or slightly lower than the single-turbo version, the way power was delivered was far more refined. This is the version most often regarded today as the peak of Atlantique development. The interior of the Venturi Atlantique was one of the things that truly set the French coupe apart from many competitors. The Lotus Esprit could be more raw, Porsche more practical, and Ferrari more prestigious. But Venturi tried to create the atmosphere of a luxurious, hand-finished Grand Tourer. The cabin was trimmed in Connolly leather or other high-quality materials, featured wooden inserts, classic white-backed VDO gauges, air conditioning, electric adjustments, and rich detailing. At the same time, you could see the typical mix of luxury and borrowed mass production parts common to small manufacturers. Some switches, ventilation controls, and small details came from Peugeot, Renault, Citroën, and other mainstream cars. For some, this was a drawback. For others, it was part of the charm of a hand-built car produced on a very small scale. The most important thing was that the driving position, visibility, and ergonomics were surprisingly good. The Atlantique was not meant to be a Spartan track monster, but a fast car that could cover long distances comfortably and with a strong sense of exclusivity. On the road, the Venturi Atlantique received very positive reviews. Journalists praised above all its handling, the lightness of the front end, the precision of the steering, and the balance resulting from the mid-engine layout. The suspension, with double wishbones at the front and a multi-link setup at the rear, provided stability and excellent grip, while the low weight meant that brakes and tires had a much easier job than in heavier rivals. The car hardly needed electronic driving aids because its mechanical balance was already excellent. Critics pointed out the gearbox, which did not always feel as precise as in a Porsche, and the character of the older PRV engine, which had noticeable turbo lag and lacked the emotional soundtrack of Italian engines. Even so, in magazine comparisons, the Atlantique often performed very well, especially against the Lotus Esprit V8. Reviewers emphasized that it was more comfortable, better refined, and less tiring in everyday driving, while still being fast enough to be considered a true supercar of its era. Unfortunately, excellent reviews did not translate into major sales success. Venturi had a problem that could not be solved by a good product alone. It lacked brand recognition, stable financial backing, and customer confidence. Anyone in the 1990s with enough money to buy a car costing around $500,000 French francs would very often choose Porsche, Ferrari, or Lotus. Venturi was more exotic, but also far riskier. The company changed owners several times. After French investors came Hubert O'Neill, later Thai investors from Benz, and finally, in 2000, the brand was taken over by Gildo Palanca Pastor from Monaco. That marked the end of Venturi as a producer of gasoline-powered sports cars. The new owner shifted the company toward electric propulsion, speed records, and Formula E. Atlantique therefore became the last true sporting Venturi from the era of gasoline-powered, mid-engined Grand Tourers. When it comes to production numbers, caution is necessary, because different sources give different figures depending on whether they count all Atlantique versions, the earlier 260, the 300, naturally aspirated models, turbo versions, biturbos, and racing cars. Most commonly, it is accepted that around 70 examples of the classic Venturi Atlantique 300 were built, including about 57 turbo versions and around 13 biturbo cars. Some sources also mention approximately 45 single-turbo cars and 13 biturbos, plus a few naturally aspirated automatic versions built for markets such as Asia. If all Atlantique versions from the early 1990s are included, the number is higher, but it still remains a very low-volume sports car. Compared to the Porsche 911 or Ferrari 348, it was practically a collector's item from birth. Right-hand drive versions are even rarer. Some sources mention only a handful. This makes every surviving Atlantique today a fascinating object for collectors of French automotive history and rare 1990s supercars. The current value of a Venturi Atlantique depends heavily on the version, condition, history, and market. Just 15 years ago, these cars could be bought for prices that seem almost ridiculous today for such a rare supercar. Around 2012, values were discussed at around €45,000, and later examples appeared in the UK for around £40,000. Today, the market looks very different. Good examples of the Atlantique 300 Turbo usually trade in the range of €90,000 to €130,000, while exceptionally clean, low-mileage cars with full history can cost more. Biturbo versions are the rarest and most desirable, so their value can exceed €130,000, and in perfect condition with the right specification, they can climb significantly higher. Yet the Venturi Atlantique still remains cheaper than many more obvious icons of the era. And that is exactly where its charm lies. It is rarer than a Ferrari, more exotic than a Porsche, and far more unusual than a Lotus, while still being relatively underrated. Today, the Venturi Atlantique remains one of the most fascinating symbols of French sporting ambition in the 1990s. It was not a perfect car. It had an engine that not everyone felt suited the supercar class. It used parts from mainstream vehicles. It had the typical issues of low-volume production, and it was born inside a company constantly fighting for survival. But it also had something that cannot be easily designed in a spreadsheet: character. It was beautiful, rare, fast, comfortable, and genuinely different. Venturi wanted to be the French Porsche, but perhaps it became something more romantic. A small brand that, for a moment, truly believed it could challenge the biggest names in the industry. Atlantique did not save the company, and it did not conquer the world, but it left behind the legend of the last true gasoline-powered Venturi. It is a car for people who do not want another obvious classic. It is a French grand tourer with soul, the final chapter of a certain era, and proof that sometimes the most interesting automotive stories are written not by the winners, but by those who came very close to greatness.